Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us this morning on this discussion on the U.S. withdrawal from Syria. As you all know, on December 19th, 2018, President Trump announced a withdrawal of U.S. troops from Syria. And ever since, there's been a big debate about how to pull out of Syria, when, and who would replace U.S.'s functions on the ground, and what would happen to forces on the ground that allied with the U.S. to fight ISIS, and what would be the regional implications. So there has been a lot of debate, and we are hoping that we won't cover all of it, because that will take probably many hours. We are trying to focus only on the withdrawal decision and what it could mean on the ground, and the relationship with Turkey, how the two NATO allies can figure out how to do this. But I'm sure in the Q&A session, many issues will come up, and we'll try to respond as much as possible. We obviously have a distinguished panel of panelists here with me. Just to my left, retired General Mark Kimmitt. He's a current defense consultant, but he appears on CNN and writes for Cypher Brief. I'm not going to go into his distinguished long bio. You can read it in the handout. We appreciate him being here to discuss this issue with us. Just to his left, Hassan Hassan is a prominent analyst on Syria. He's Syrian himself. He is with the Tahrir Institute for Middle East Policy. He also works at Georgetown's, I believe, I don't want to misstate but he's with Georgetown as well, working on counterterrorism issues and ISIS. Just to his left, Andrew Tabler is no less prominent analyst with the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. So we are very grateful they're here. My colleague Kılıç Kanat's plane is busy de-icing. We are hoping at some point he'll make it, but we will proceed without him at this point, and I may have to intervene a bit more to discuss Turkey-related issues in his absence. But without further ado, I just want to turn to my left to General Kimmitt for his brief introductory remarks. Thank you.
Well, first of all, thanks for putting this together. And I was taken aback that Andrew was referred to as distinguished, John was referred to as distinguished, and I was referred to as retired. But I'll try to get over that.
That was on purpose.
Indeed. Listen, I just got back from Iraq on Monday, and this obviously was a topic of conversation while I was there. I am sorry that it took the death of 4 Americans to try to put more highlight on this question of the U.S. withdrawal out of Syria. I think the debate has been abysmally superficial, and anytime you get a bipartisan consensus on anything in this town, you've got to question it severely. I'm afraid that many of the decisions and the views on the withdrawal were made presumptively because people just don't like Trump. Look, I'm an analyst. It is not my position to opine. It's my decision to sort of lay out all the analytics on this. So my thesis remains, as I have said numerous times, both on television appearances and also in writing, that there remains legitimate reasons and perhaps overwhelmingly positive reasons for the United States to be getting out of Syria rather than staying in. We all understand the arguments about staying in range from, again, continuing to defeat ISIS, so on and so forth. But let's talk about the legitimate reasons that weren't behind the tweet that may have been put into consideration for the withdrawal. Number one, ISIS may not be defeated. It is certainly degraded. The caliphate is gone. Their ability to operate as military forces no longer exists, but they still are a threat. Nobody doubts that. However, they are not an existential threat to the United States. ISIS at this point is in 25 different countries. We're in 2 of them fighting ISIS. Using this argument for staying in Syria simply to complete the destruction of ISIS carries over to the fact, well, if they're not completely defeated there and we need to stay, then the question is, why aren't we in 23 other countries? So that's number one. Because really, at this point, it's somebody else's problem. Once something is not an existential threat to the United States, the question is, do we want to put our blood and treasure, as we did the other day, on the line when somebody else ought to be doing the job? The second point I'd make is, candidly, we're ahead of our skis in Syria. We have one purpose to be in Syria, and that is to defeat and destroy ISIS. We were starting to see inevitable signs of mission creep inside Syria. They were talking about training 40,000 local troops. That's a multi-year prospect. Candidly, if there is any kind of post-Syria resolution or political resolution, if we were there, no doubt we'd be signing up for Sector Northeast in the peace enforcement operations. I don't think the American people have had the issue of a sustained and extended U.S. presence in Syria told to them. As a military person who has served around the world, to include in Bosnia and a very short period of time in Kosovo, with what the military was looking at, and additionally these other issues such as keeping an eye on the Iranians, that was a 10-year mission, number one. And number two, it violated the terms of us being in that country. None of those are authorized under the authority for the use of military force. Authority for the use got us into Syria to fight ISIS. All these other missions, classic mission creep. Third, this notion that, and I'm not doing this because of where we are, but this notion that somehow the YPG are, brave, democratic-seeking allies of the United States, I think needs to be questioned. When Jim Jeffrey used to talk about this, he reminded us that the mission of us working alongside with the YPG for the purpose of defeating ISIS was temporary, transactional, and tactical. There was never an expectation that we had a responsibility to protect the YPG when the mission was done. We have now embraced that mission, fully understand, but I think we also need to understand who our newest allies are, their background, what they want to do, what their long-term aspirations are, and say, is that in line with what we've done as Americans and what we're planning to do there? I now need to check my notes of what I wrote, and that's my Safe Zones article. And then at that time, I was also concerned about and had an expectation that we were going to confront that inevitable period when the Turkish forces would come into contact not only with ISIS, but also with U.S. forces and the YPG. That was inevitable. And do we want to risk a major confrontation between two NATO allies as we have to make the choice, do we fight the Turks? Do we fend the YPG? Who owns what territory? So for all these reasons, primarily that of we're beyond our mission authorities, ISIS is degraded to the point where they're no longer our problem. We were looking at a long-term mission that has really not been well advertised and explained and sold to the American people, among other issues, is why I think that there are legitimate reasons for us to be having a deep national debate rather than a superficial debate, if for no other reason than to ensure that those 4 Americans that were killed 2 days ago are respected for what they've done, because we owe that debate to be had.
Thank you, General. Hassan.
So I want to make two points. The first one, I think one problem with this debate is that it has been hijacked by two arguments that I think are right, but they're irrelevant to the whole idea of Americans being in Syria or the American presence inside Syria. The first one is that we've heard it since Trump announced the withdrawal, is that what could 2,000 American troops possibly do in Syria against Iran? And Iran, I think it's irrelevant to this thing because the mission is not about Iran inside Syria.
Right.
And some people say it was hijacked by people inside the government. But I think also analysts hijacked it because they turned all the attention to Iran, whether having 2,000 people are enough to fight Iran or not. That's really, for me, as someone from eastern Syria, but also as an analyst of Syria, I think that's irrelevant. Because once you settle the question of Assad, you make peace with Assad, Assad is staying there, then Iran becomes less of a problem. And in my opinion, it becomes a problem for Assad, not for us. Because if Assad wants autonomy in Syria or his own regime's autonomy, then he has to deal with Iran and kind of manage Iranian presence in Syria. The second argument that I think hijacked the debate was also what could 2,000 troops or soldiers, American troops inside Syria do against ISIS, as if these 2,000 people were fighting ISIS. Or kind of they are the sort of the spearhead of the fight against ISIS. I think that's also irrelevant. You could fight ISIS, you could stay in Syria, you could have a presence in Syria, you can control and manage your presence inside Syria without having these 2,000 troops. They could leave and you could still decide with other countries the fate of this zone in eastern Syria, which is 1/3 of Syria. And I think this whole debate, watching it closely from day one, has been flawed from day one. And it was under the previous administration, it was worsened by this administration. So both blame. This is, both take blame for this. And it was flawed in the beginning. And I think the kind of the original sin of this sort of campaign is that it was predicated on this idea that you could ignore the Syrian conflict and fight ISIS, which was really just a symptom of this whole conflict. So you ignore what others aspire to do inside Syria, what their objectives are. You ignore Turkey, you ignore the Syrians, you ignore the Kurds as well, and the other Kurds, wherever, and then you focus the effort and channel the effort to fight ISIS there, and that's the mission. And I think you remember when the Obama administration designed the campaign against ISIS, the debate was whether we should align ourselves with the Syrian government to fight ISIS or not. And I think the side that won was, no, we don't want to basically align ourselves with the repressive regime like Bashar Assad's regime, but at the same time, we should stop this trend of weakening the regime further. And I think that's started to materialize and manifest itself in John Kerry's plan to de-escalate the conflict a year later, especially when the Russians came in. Even I think I met someone senior at the time during the Obama administration, when the Russians intervened in Syria, they were partly happy about that somehow worrying about the collapse of the regime is no longer a worry for the Americans. They can just focus on ISIS and allow Russia to stabilize the rest of Syria. So the whole concept is flawed. But to move on to kind of what's the danger of the withdrawal, I think that's what you wanted me to kind of talk about as well. Obviously, I don't think the risk of this withdrawal is only limited to ISIS. In my opinion, the biggest worry, and I think now it's been contained a little bit with the conversations that happened since and the slowing down of the withdrawal rather than immediate and rapid, was the unraveling of the Syrian conflict. Because the Syrian conflict was de-escalated by the Russians and Turkey and others, but the peace was fragile and still fragile. It could collapse, it could crumble, and we could see another wave of fighting that would be exploited not by the moderates, because the moderates have been decimated. No moderates are viable forces now or exist in Syria, not from the regime side, not from the opposition side. So it would be a bad fight if there's a renewed fighting, and the kind of the rebel sides, or it would be hijacked by groups like Nusra and ISIS. They would be the dominant forces. There's no question about that. There's no no longer have the same dynamic that we had 2012, 2013, and even 2014. So that's one big worry for me. The other worry is ISIS, obviously. I think it's still a potent force. It's still, forget about what headlines say these days, what the American-led coalition's data say about the numbers of ISIS. I still think there are thousands of ISIS sympathizers, not fighters. Forget about the fighters. There are probably 1,000 or 2 fighters still with ISIS. There are still huge numbers of people who are back home, staying at home with their families, their children, their adults who are still sympathizers with ISIS, but they are no longer in the fight. And I also don't claim that these are sleeper cells, meaning they are preparing for another day to fight. No, some of them are genuinely tired of the fight and they don't want to fight. So they're hanging out in neighboring countries, in Syria, in regime areas as well, in Damascus and elsewhere. There are still ISIS sympathizers who nobody knows about, or not many people know about. Some people see them, but they don't think they are still with ISIS. And I worry about these numbers because the circumstances in Syria will return to violence at some point. I think even academic literature says that 40 to 60% of settled conflicts return to violence, and I think Syria will be one of those countries or conflicts that will return to violence at some point. I think all these circumstances are, the circumstances in the areas where the Americans used to operate are not ready for a withdrawal. There's another point I want to talk about, but I think I should leave it there because I kind of took long, which is about the idea was not about, I mean, the Americans were on the way out and ISIS on the way out. And Trump's decision, sped up the withdrawal of the Americans, but also slowed down the idea that ISIS was on the way out.
Thank you, Hassan. Andrew.
Well, first, thank you very much for the introduction. It's a pleasure to be up here, and it's always easy to go last, or easier, although in this subject, maybe not. So just a couple of comments. First, I agree with my colleagues up here.
One distinguished, one retired.
Exactly. But I think all of us agree. Look, as somebody who's focused on Syria for far too long, and I'm not Syrian, just in case you haven't guessed, but I have.
It looks like one.
I focus on Syria policy, as I think many of you know. I used to live in Syria for quite some time and worked there, and have a deep affection for its people and sympathy. So one of the frustrating aspects of trying to talk about Syria policy and the outcome of the Syrian war is the superficial nature of the not only just the debate, but the basic material that goes into the debate. And the reason for that, I don't think is because people are stupid or because they want to simplify it necessarily. There is politics that gets involved, unfortunately. It's because it is enormously complex. There are a lot of moving parts. Anybody who's ever covered the Lebanon or the Lebanese Civil War will understand this. I mean, you have to really know your back brief book very well in order to understand the moving parts. And so Hassan did a very good job of talking about the sort of the eastern part of the country, the western part of the country. And so, a couple of things. You'll read a lot of stories that Bashar al-Assad has won the Syrian civil war. It's almost in every paper every day, major papers, right? Of course, the problem with that argument is that that's legally true, right? I mean, at least in the western part of the country, you have Assad regime flagged forces with insignia in many parts of the country. However, it's not the Syrian Arab Army of old. Many whole corps of the Syrian military are organized by Russia with units, local units and National Defense Force units, which have been trained by the IRGC. And they have some insignia as well. And they're in some areas out in the Euphrates. Then you have a whole host of other groups, many of which are Shia militia, which also are uniformed and have their insignia, and they fly flags and march out through the Sunni Arab-dominated areas of eastern Syria in broad daylight for everybody to see. Right? And this is the way that the Assad regime, with Russian and Iranian support, was able to take over about 60% of Syrian territory or so. Right? But in the other areas of Syria, where the fight against ISIS was first and foremost, I think, you had the intervention of Turkey, which has helped with the Syrian opposition take over two different areas, that it plays a major role in Idlib, in that area. And then, of course, in eastern Syria, where the United States partnered with the YPG to defeat ISIS. And so the Syrian civil war was not won by Bashar al-Assad in a traditional way that a leader would win back his territory. The way the war has settled out, de-escalated until now, it's been through foreign military intervention. And you can see this on the maps. I think the problem is, of course, is the complexity. If you look at, there are a number of outfits around town that put out some maps, whether it's at my institute, Institute for the Study of War, but a whole host of others, and they'll show you a little bit. But a lot of this gets down into the realm of military intelligence and so on, of which Turkey, the United States, and all the other parties are involved. The outcome of that war was unacceptable to two neighboring countries and remains so. One is Turkey, which is the subject of our talk today, and the other one is Israel. For Israel, the outcome of Shia militia and other Iranian-backed units and based in Syria, moving heavy weapons into the country, is something that they have recently talked and acted to interdict. And that's going to be a trend going forward if this war is really going to settle out. The other, of course, aspect, and it gets us today, Turkey regards, which is understandable, the PKK as an existential threat. And the United States was in a challenge. The Trump administration inherited a policy that it did not make, which is typical for the United States, right? We're a democracy, we shift every 4 or 8 years, usually 8 years these days, and sometimes it's radically so. And we inherited a policy where the United States backed the YPG. The YPG is the military wing of the PYD, which is the Syrian wing of the PKK, right? And over that time, many American leaders and others went to the PYD leadership and the YPG and said, hey, if you really want to spin off the PKK and not antagonize the Turks, you really have to do it. You have to really, you really need to spin off and become your own master, so to speak. There were a lot of things that weighed on that. I think first and foremost was the nature of the organization. I think the PKK and the PYD overlap heavily. There is some separation, but it was not enough to satisfy NATO ally Turkey. And this was something that I think many of us saw coming. It was an inevitability. Personally, I think my hope at the time was that it was going to be more manageable, that we had more time. And sometimes, General Kimmitt knows this much better than I do. I've never served in the military other than some ROTC training in college, which doesn't count. And that is sometimes you're sent into a meeting or a situation to stall. You need time. And the US needed time to try and work this out so that Turkey and the YPG would not be antagonized, and that the ultimate victors of this would not be ISIS and the Assad regime in Iran. I'm not pointing at Hassan. No, he only wrote the great book on ISIS. Yeah. So that was the challenge, right? And Ambassador Jeffrey got thrust into the middle of that, and he's been hustling, as you know, to try and head that off. But the problem was, of course, that the mission of militarily defeating ISIS and then keeping ISIS down became sort of two different things. In the one sense of militarily defeating ISIS was the by, with, and through campaign of Operation Inherent Resolve. Keeping ISIS down involved the creation of internal security forces inside of the YPG areas, the SDF areas. And that was something that seems, at least from my reading of the situation, set off an alarm bell with Turkey and President Erdogan specifically. And so this was a Gordian knot. Now, my last point is, and it led to the announcement of an American withdrawal from Syria. However, what that withdrawal is going to look like, what the pace of it will be, and what will replace it is a matter of intense, very subtle debate between the US and Turkey, between the US and the SDF, and then, of course, the various parties who are active inside of Syria, because the US and Turkey, I mean, I think the larger issue for me here is, as someone looking at this, is, well, understanding Turkey's concern about the YPG and its relationship to the PKK, it's important to understand a little bit and remember that if the Assad regime, the Russians, and the Iranians benefit from this withdrawal, you are going to see a kind of encirclement around you of a constellation of forces that is going to probably constrain what Turkey does and not expand its field. And this is something I think the US and Turkey share. How we get to that, how you head that off, what kind of timeline, I don't know, but it's a real challenge, and I hope we can work this out diplomatically and get something that's moving in the right direction soon. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. You brought the subject to Turkey, so let me say a couple words because Kılıç is late. I think the insistence, and for the last several years, Turkey has been pressuring the US. Look, you have to stop collaborating with the YPG. These are terrorists. They're linked to PKK. They're trying to achieve political autonomy for themselves. They're not in it to fight ISIS, etc. Many arguments. And the US often with, acknowledging quite a bit of the Turkey's concerns, but like Andrew said, went for what seemed like, from Ankara's perspective, a stalling tactic. So, but it wasn't clear what the US ultimately wanted to do. But in the meantime, YPG kept enlarging its influence and legitimizing itself in the eyes of the West, and most critically, under the umbrella sort of name Kurdish allies, right? So there are many different Kurdish groups in the region, and Turkey is allied with quite a few of them. So for Turkey, the matter wasn't the Kurds. It was specifically the YPG and the empowerment of the YPG with the US military support, but which translates to much bigger political support gives it political legitimacy. That was one of the big problems. So Turkey undertook some of the operations on its own to limit where YPG would go, especially west of Euphrates, and has been pushing about Manbij, has been pushing and was threatening an imminent operation along the border, which was controlled by YPG. So Turkey's first and foremost concern there was that the Turkish border should be free of ISIS and YPG control. And interestingly, I think this decision was abrupt, but like we were discussing earlier, Trump did this 6 months ago. He said he wanted to leave. Everybody knew he wanted to leave. How and when and where, those were the unanswered questions. In many ways, Trump answered it. That's why you find Erdogan saying, this is the right decision. Because not right decision about we know everything that we can do on the ground going forward, but I think in the sense of, okay, you put a name to this mission. Like this was an ISIS mission, as you promised, and ISIS is no longer holding territory, and we can pull out. So this actually gives some sense to the American presence, as General Kimmitt was discussing, how it creates a strong argument for U.S. withdrawal. Not to abuse it much further than this, my role, I want to turn to General Kimmitt. You've been engaged in these type of, within NATO partners, among allies, discussions about, in the Balkans you were mentioning, how do you think that the U.S. and Turkish militaries right now, when they're sitting down and talking, how they could move forward on what kind of withdrawal-related issues specifically?
Well, that's my most recent article talking about safe zones in Syria. Mm-hmm. Yes, I'm doing a shameless plug for the Cipher brief. Has a paywall. We'll take anybody. People are saying, well, what does a safe zone mean? And everybody yet again is starting to have superficial discussions and not the analytics. My view is that the closest approximation of what we're trying to come up with is not Operation Northern Watch, is not provide comfort. It's the zone of separation that we established as part of the Dayton Peace Accord, which set up a buffer between the Serbian forces and the Bosniak forces. It would seem to me that is what they're trying to do, but we'll see what the discussions end up. But I think in theory, what we are trying to do is recognize the legitimate national security concerns of Turkey, and at the same time trying to prevent the accidental conflict or intentional conflict between Turkish forces and the YPG. Accepting both those responsibilities, the United States is trying to be the broker of an outcome where there is a separation. YPG is protected. Turkey's legitimate national security concerns are honored. What does that look like? 20 miles into from the border with Turkey would be considered a buffer zone, perhaps. Again, my speculation. No forces would be allowed in. No effects of those forces would be allowed in. Aircraft, artillery, so on and so forth. None of the effects inside the buffer zone would be allowed out. You would need to get a robust force in there to be a peace enforcement operation. Probably would not be from either side. I can't imagine that it would be helpful to have either the Turkish forces running joint patrols in there or the YPG forces claiming that they must go see their mother and daughter, hence they should be allowed in there. So you bring in a monitoring force with the purpose of monitoring the agreement. The real hard questions then become, what is the mandate of that enforcement force, whether it's UN, whether it's NATO, whether it's OSCE? Are they there just to monitor and report? Are they there to keep a peace? Are they there to impose a peace? With that, what of course will be the rules of engagement? Will they be able to use lethal force? What are the military aspects they could bring in? But most importantly, what do you do about the violations inside that buffer zone? These are all the technical issues, but I think at the end what we're trying to do is set up a comfortable space between the YPG forces and the Turkish forces so that we can focus more on, as Andrew said, defeating ISIS than arbitrating a dispute between two organizations.
Okay. Hassan, you said that the eastern part of Euphrates, it wasn't exactly ready for a withdrawal. So based on what the general was saying, what the U.S. might be trying to achieve going forward, when would it be ready for a withdrawal from your perspective?
So I think a perfect example to give, and it's a recent example, so anyone can understand, is Kirkuk, October 2017, so a year and a half almost ago, when the city or the province shifted hands from the Peshmerga, the Kurds who have always or for a long time took over and secured, especially since 2014 when ISIS tried to take over, kind of advance towards the Kurdish areas. When they took over, they stabilized the area, and then what happened was Abadi government wanted this Kirkuk back. And you remember in October 2017, that's when the city shifted hands, and the Shia militias from Baghdad and the security forces went in and took over. What happened was, since then, ISIS recovered. You can see the data, you can read the news. That's a perfect example of what happens when a city shifts hands without a plan, without a very thought out strategy of who takes over and how. And once new security forces, even though they are effective, these forces secured Kirkuk, Tikrit, for example, they secured Anbar, they secured some of these areas like Ramadi and elsewhere, right? But when one force leaves and another force comes, that creates a vacuum, but also creates new opportunities for ISIS and others, because you might have a lot of the population who like the newcomers, they maybe develop affinity to them, rapport, whatever you want to call it. The newcomers come in, maybe a few dozens don't like the newcomers, and that opens doors for ISIS. And that's what happened. This is a concrete example of what happens when you just leave, or when a new force comes in. And I think the attack in Manbij, tragic as it is...
Hassan, I'm sorry to interrupt.
Yeah.
But here we're talking about going from a sub-state actor to a state actor.
Yeah.
So
I'll continue. So Manbij, obviously it's a tragedy what happened, the attack there. But also it's a useful example, reminder, just before you leave, this is what happens. And Manbij was a city where the United States paid so much attention to. They, even ISIS, if you read ISIS Neba newspaper on this Thursday about the attack, and they explain how the city is heavily guarded by the YPG, by the SDF, through checkpoints, the heavily presence on the ground, CCTV, the whole city is surrounded, and American patrols comes in every now and then. They know the city, and they said we tried several times to attack the U.S. and we failed, but this time worked out for them. So that tells you, like, when a city, even though Manbij has been, again, the U.S. has paid so much attention to, ISIS still attacked, and that tells you something. That tells you about ISIS will continue to try to recover in these areas. They have sleeper cells. ISIS itself admits that they have sleeper cells within Manbij. So imagine if a newcomer comes in and takes over from the SDF. It will open doors. It will be a vacuum. It will create some vacuum. It will open new opportunities for ISIS, because if the regime comes in and takes over Manbij, say probably a few thousands in the city, they were satisfied with the SDF. They were content with how they did things, or they at least got used to it. But when the regime comes in, that's a whole different ballgame for a lot of people in eastern Syria. Just another concrete example of that evidence is that when the regime liberated, quote unquote, the western part of the Euphrates River in Deir Zor. So these are the cities of Deir Zor, the city of Mayadin, the city of Al-Bukamal. In October, that was also October 2017, when they announced the victory there. Still, not a single person, and this is obviously exaggeration, went back to these areas. These areas are empty towns, still destroyed. Nobody comes in. That tells you how popular the regime is in some of these areas. And even if people are comfortable coming back, there's nothing there to come back to. Manbij is a success story. We have to admit. But I have to also come back to the initial point I made at the first place in the beginning, which is the whole policy was flawed. The way the U.S. did things in Manbij and Raqqa was already flawed from the beginning. So anything return to violence will be inevitable, because Turkey is not going to be happy having the PKK or the YPG present in the city. So I understand that argument, but I also understand the practicality of shifting hands. So in conclusion, I just want to say that in order to avoid what happened in Kirkuk, Manbij has to be dealt with. The PKK, the YPG has to leave town, because this is an Arab city at the end of the day. Forget the regime, forget Turkey, forget Iran. This is a predominantly Arab area, so it has to be politically addressed, the kind of demographically reflected in that sense. But it has to be done peacefully, without a new forces come in and taking over from the SDF. Now, how that will happen, that's a big question.
So can you tie that to when it would be ready for a withdrawal? Do you mean these attacks have to, some sort of political deal have to be found first, and then the U.S. should?
So I have an exit strategy I could offer for the United States.
Yeah.
So the exit strategy, in my opinion, is these areas have to eventually return to the Syrian state. They have to be controlled by Damascus. But there has to be an interim solution. That's why, to tie it up, to also tie it to my original remarks, has to be a handover, peaceful handover through a political settlement. So all these areas should not return to the regime through violence, should not return to Turkey, say, through violence. It has to be some sort of political settlement. That's why it was wrong fundamentally for Trump to say we're leaving Syria after all what has been done. This is not about Iran. This is not about fighting ISIS. This is about making gains, securing and stabilizing this region, and then deciding where this region will go next. This is a post-conflict situation, not a conflict situation. What I mean by that is the conflict has already been addressed there. What you need to do is sustain that gain that you made in eastern Syria. 1/3 of Syria, that's a huge chunk of Syria. How to sustain the gain there? You do it by stabilizing these areas, maybe not necessarily by American taxpayers, because there are other countries who are willing to contribute. Turkey would be one, but it has to be done by in a way that addresses their political grievances. And that goes back to also the original plan by the Obama administration to somehow ignore Turkish priorities, not read history, and somehow just decide, oh, we're going to go there, use this bunch of fighters who seem to be great warriors and fight ISIS and then get out of there. That's not how it works.
Thank you, Hassan. Andrew, my last question to the panel, and then we'll turn to the questions from the audience. Do you see going forward Ambassador Jim Jeffries' mission, Syria mission, as more, like Hassan is suggesting, focused on politics while managing the withdrawal, and how that could play out?
Yes, I did. Well, of course, now he's dual-hatted. He is the ISIS czar, as we say, and also the special envoy for Syrian engagement. So, in a way, those two portfolios have been merged. And I think this is where I think you're going to see part of his efforts with Joel Rayburn. I think getting people back to the table in Geneva and seeing if you can come up with a negotiated settlement. And this is where it gets very tricky, because the de-escalation agreements, which have been put into place because the regime was so militarily weakened, a lot of times when there's progress in these zones, the regime goes off elsewhere and goes on the offensive with the Russians and the Iranians, and I think that's the real issue here. If the U.S. stayed for a little longer, I think we would have been in a time when maybe things would have balanced out a little bit more. We had the de-escalation agreement in the Northwest. That could have got talks going. I'm not terribly confident at all that you're going to have an easy outcome to those talks, but we'll see. So I think there's that. The overall fight against ISIS, I mean, I think Hassan put his finger on it. There's the military aspect, but the nature of the organization itself means that you have its resurgence in a different form, and this is an inevitable part of, I think, these counterterrorism activities, unfortunately. So that's going to be a real challenge. How do you do that, and whose problem is that going to be? If you have American troops there, they're exposed to attacks. So that's a liability, potentially a political liability, and a very serious one for U.S. troops, of course. If you have this is Hassan's excellent point, right? I mean, the problem is that you have the Assad regime poised to cross the river and to go into some of these areas, but they're not the most popular people in the world, just in case you hadn't figured that out by now. There's, after you use repeatedly strategic weapons against your own people, almost your entire stockpile, including surface-to-surface missiles as well, and you end up in this situation, and you go back into these areas, I think a lot of people out in eastern Syria realize that governance under that regime, as is something that's unpalatable and it's going to be hard to manage. And it's not also the secret of Syria engagement, which I used to do before the war broke out. Anytime that regime feels confident and relaxed, it becomes more difficult to deal with. It's a paradox, and unfortunately, this could be the situation we're looking at here as we go into talks in Geneva.
Thank you, Andrew. Let me turn to the audience. One here. Let me collect three right there.
Lori Milroy, Kurdistan 24. Maybe one or two of you folks can help answer this question, because I don't understand what this proposal is about. There's going to be the safe zone, which is the 20-mile buffer. But what about the rest of eastern Syria? Is that to remain under SDF control? What is your understanding? And what is your understanding of that? And then is Turkey, if it doesn't remain under SDF control, is Turkey capable of even controlling that area? Who's going to be in charge of it?
Well, right there in this third row.
Morning, Wathik from Iraq Embassy. Thank you so much for this. I need your idea about what's going on in Idlib with the new events with RTS, and when we have kind of total hegemony by Salvation government nowadays. Is that threatening Idlib deal? Is there any compromise between RTS and other state actors or whatever? Thank you so much.
Okay, the question was about Idlib and one there.
Salvation.
My name is Karwan Zubayan. I'm with the KRG. Let me bring your attention to an op-ed by Brad McGurk this morning. And I'll just point out 3 points I'd like to see to get your take on it. One, he says, Turkey can't operate hundreds of miles deep into Syria without major U.S. support. So if Turkey is to take control of the situation, does that mean U.S. still needs to stay? Two, he also makes the point that as Turkey expands into its reach into Syria, you'll see more Arab partners get close to Damascus. And he gives the example of United Arab Emirates and Bahrain reopening their embassies. Three, he makes this point that Turkey's incursion into SDF areas would precipitate chaos and environment for extremists to thrive. My question for you is, Hassan made the point of Kirkuk that when it changed hands, ISIS reemerged and thrived. And then, Kadir, you pushed back, you said, wait a minute, we're going to take this from a non-state actor to a state actor's hand. Well, is that true? Because if you look at the Afrin example, Turkey is working with proxies that are not necessarily part of the state actor. Thank you.
Why don't I turn to you about the safe zone and capabilities of Turkey? I guess I would have to respond a bit, but you want to take that?
Well, I haven't read Brett's article. I think Brett's positions on this are well known. I don't think anything in the safe zone initiative is considering having Turkey go hundreds of miles. I think, is that what you said, 100 miles? Yeah, look, let's take this one step at a time. The safe zone initiative probably will end up turning out to be an exclusion zone for both Turkish forces and for YPG forces, and it could well be an exclusion zone for American forces as well. I don't know. I haven't seen the broad construct, and nobody else has. I think there's more security around that decision than there is around the Mueller investigation. So let's see what comes out.
Yeah, well, I read the article, and obviously McGurk is a big champion of the relationship with the YPG. He gave some pictures that caused, diplomatic problems between the two NATO allies. Is the argument is based on, I think, the press reports a couple weeks ago about Turkey asking the U.S. to give a lot of military support to be able to hold this territory. But I think it is a bit misrepresented in the sense that these are discussions about how to help U.S. withdraw, right? So the air zone, for instance, like the flight, U.S. is controlling some, now I don't want to get into the general's expertise area, but what do they call it?
East of the Euphrates, if a Russian plane flies, it dies. It's that simple.
So U.S.
Close enough?
Like figuring out these kind of arrangements. U.S., for instance, won't leave Tanf Air Base, and then where YPG exactly goes to reassure Turkey's security along the border. But I think you can represent these kind of discussions as saying, oh, Turkey is requiring too much and we need to actually stay even more. I don't think that's true. That's the pushback by people who are advocating for a continued U.S. presence and continued U.S. relationship with the YPG. But the political decision has been made about the withdrawal. And you're right, Turkey does work with opposition forces. It considers them opposition forces. So it's not only state actor that's entering, but the state state actor here is going to be all the outside forces, outside countries are in engagement with some sort of sub-state actor, but Turkey is the one with the forces on the ground that has fought ISIS. Let's not forget that. One more thing about capability. When Turkey said, look, this is not working out, several years ago, Turkey had no troops in the north of Syria. Everybody said Turkey can't enter. It doesn't have the capacity. It won't go in, etc. Once Turkey entered, they said Turkey won't go far enough for far deep. And Turkey conducted further and further operations. So I think it's often underestimated Turkey's sort of both capability and willingness to go after what it sees as the Syrian branch of a terrorist organization. So I think Turkey would be ready to put in a lot more resources, and it has suggested those before the Raqqa operation as well. I don't want to take over this panel. I'm sorry.
Let me just make sure.
Yes.
I made a flippant comment that I don't want to see in a headline in the Washington Post. We have a very good air coordination mechanism between the Russians and the U.S. Obviously, my point was flippant, so I would like to withdraw it.
That's a good nuance to point out. Hassan, maybe you talk about a bit about Idlib and you address anything.
I just want to say one point before that. I'm reminded of constantly when I kind of think of this U.S. policy in Syria, it reminded of an Arabic saying that says a stingy person ends up eating his lunch twice because, and I think the American presence in Syria is the least expensive one. If they leave, I think they're going to have to come back at some point, but we'll come back to fight another war that's a more complicated war because are they going to provide U.S. Air Force kind of air cover for the Syrian regime when the regime takes over areas like Deir ez-Zor and Raqqa? Also, to answer your question, I think Deir ez-Zor and Raqqa is the kind of the soft underbelly, or kind of the soft target sort of for the Syrian regime in Russia. You might probably see Chechens going to Raqqa at some point if there ends up to be kind of a negotiated settlement. Turkey will be in the north, take over the areas. I also want to concede that I'm guilty of what you just said about underestimating Turkey's willingness to go into Syria. I didn't expect that Turkey would go into Afrin, for example, because it's just a stronghold for the Kurds, and it would be a long-term, kind of long, durable insurgency there. but they seem to be more willing. I think we tend to forget the history. Just again, in 1998, the Turks wanted to invade Syria, even though Syria was much stronger than now, and the Assad regime, even though it was stronger, it had to basically bow and say, okay, whatever you want regarding the YPG. So this is I think some American officials underestimate how serious this is. This is worse than how the Israelis see Hezbollah, probably, or how the Americans see Al-Qaeda in some circles, especially in the region, not here, obviously. About the north, also to speak about the northwest, the situation recently with the Tahrir Sham, Nusra formerly, taking over this area and kind of consolidating control of the area, both makes things easier and more difficult. Easier in the sense that this is now an easier argument for Russia to say who's in control of that area. It's Al-Qaeda affiliate or offshoot, however you want to see it. And we need to clear that area. So a lot of people will agree that that area has to be cleared of Al-Qaeda. It's no longer Ahrar Sham or Zinki providing a way out. So you support these forces. They take on Nusra, and then you talk to them at with them at some point. That's no longer the situation. So it's a lot easier for the regime to make the argument now. But it's harder because now the choice is clear. It's a binary. Either the regime goes back to Idlib, or Nusra stays there, or Hayat Tahrir Sham. So a lot of people would be reluctant, at least for now, to see that change of hands in Idlib.
Andrew, did you want to address any of this? Let me get more questions from the back. There's a journalist there, and all the way in the back as well. Just one. Keep it to one or two at most.
Okay. So we talked about safe zones. We have seen many attempts in Syria for kind of the de-escalation zones, safe zones, and nearly all of them failed. Actually, the peacekeeping operations across the globe are kind of prone to failure, and we are talking about Syria, where so many different groups who are existentially threatening each other are in the same area, and we are trying to implement a safe zone, which is, you suggested that maybe an international organizational kind of coordination which will lead the safe zone. Without a crucial or without an substantial force taking control of that territory, how could it be possible to create a safe zone in that dangerous and complicated area? That's my first question. The other one, Hassan talked about the ISIS sympathizers inside the Syrian kind of population right now. How could you prevent another kind of insurgency or another kind of terror threat inside Syria if you are kind of encouraging a group to take over a territory, like for example YPG, or if you are bringing in Shia militias and then encourage them to take over some of the other territories and then let the rest of the population stay discriminated or kind of deprived from certain powers.
I think this is enough,
okay.
Qasim, if you don't mind.
That's fine.
There's a question in the back, all the way in the back. Thank you.
Where was Qasim?
Hi, this is Mehmet from TRT World. So in the last year, we've seen drastic changes in the US and Turkey relations, and this coincided with the election circle. Maybe it's causation, maybe it's correlation. I won't go there, but is there a chance that the 2020 election cycle will hamper this coordination, and what happens if that becomes a reality?
Okay. So we are again on safe zone. Do you want to address it, or
sure? I'll take it. Yeah. Look, I think every safe zone, humanitarian safe zone, zone of separation, humanitarian corridor, all of them are fraught with difficulties. I think that there's a little bit of difference in this particular initiative because the U.S. is going to end up to be the guarantor since they have good relationships with both the Turkish military and with the YPG. So I think that it has a good prospect of being successful. I would not want to see the U.S. forces in there doing the monitoring and enforcing because in both cases we would be actually monitoring our allies and we'd be enforcing penalties against our allies. So as I said, concluding my article, it may not work, it may work, but just because it hasn't worked elsewhere is not justification for not attempting it here. Because I think in this case, the conditions are such that it probably has a higher prospect. And if you take a hard look at the zone of separation, which eventually became the inter-entity boundary line, during the time that it was up, there were no violations of it. There were no casualties associated with it, and it actually was a good transition to setting up what are now not known as borders, but an inter-entity boundary line between the two federation locations. If you got a better idea, we'd be more than happy to hear it.
Certain deconflicting zones have worked at least to some extent, wouldn't you say, Andrew?
They worked for a time. They did not work to, it wasn't a safe zone. Mm-hmm. They were de-escalation zones.
Yes.
And when you start hearing words like this, you get into technicalities that show you that it's the transitory nature of the zone. So it's short term, usually followed by a military offensive. In the case of the Assad regime in the southwest, mm-hmm. We could see that. I think it's likely we will see that in other parts of the country. However, the Assad regime's forces are stretched pretty thin. So, we will have to see. This will buy some time. Mm-hmm. It won't, I think, solve the problem. Yeah. We'll have to wait and see what the moves of the political moves are of the YPG with the regime in the coming days, and that's the thing to really watch, because
do you think that could hamper what General was talking about, how U.S. has weight with the SDF?
Yeah, I mean the Syrian regime's objective is to get the United States out of Syria post haste, because we have the ability militarily and politically and so on to seriously constrain them, not defeat them, not even push out Iranian forces without a really concerted long-term effort, but we have the ability to turn things around, and this is what we've seen U.S. military activity against both Shia militia and the Wagner Group forces within the last year that are indicative of this, and they're very aware of that.
Mm-hmm.
I would just simply say, quick response, I don't think that there's any comparison between the de-escalation zones that we've had in Syria, where you actually had warring parties fighting prior to that, both required to pull out of that de-escalation zone.
It wasn't the same. Yeah.
Yeah. It's. I don't think that's what we're contemplating here.
That's right. Hassan.
About ISIS, right?
There was a.
Oh, the Iranians and yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, I think it's I saw that firsthand in Deir ez-Zor, for example, where I come from, where people, even supporters of the Syrian regime, when they started to see Iranians going into these areas and attacking and liberating supposedly, they became worried, because Iran and Shia militias, and not Shia militias, but like Iran's agenda in Syria, especially in eastern Syria, has always been seen suspiciously, because there were attempts to Shiitize places like Deir ez-Zor and Raqqa and elsewhere. They also targeted specific tribes like the Baggara, who traced their origins to the Prophet's family, and target those people to say, your origins is Shia, so go back, try to kind of Shiitize these areas. So there's always that kind of extra sensitive dynamic when it comes to Shia militias. So once you start Shia militias there, that's a problem. Also, the Kurds, again, I was kind of critical of allowing the YPG to expand in these areas. And I might see problems with reversing that now for practical reasons, but it's a very sensitive issue for these people to be controlled by out-of-towners, people who are out of town, they're not from there. This is an extra also sensitive issue for these people. One final point I want to make about ISIS, because a lot of people don't know, even me, like obviously, and people who follow this closely, how ISIS is today, where it's going next. And my assessment is, I think it will be another year or two, probably 2 years, for us to really know, for us to really see the full potential of ISIS, the potential that it gained over the past 3 years or 4 years when they took over areas and they managed people and so on and so forth. I think for now, they are on the run and they are trying to regroup. They are trying hard to regroup. It's not working very well for them. They're calling on sleeper cells to wake up and so on and so forth. It's hard. But they have the numbers, they have the circumstances, the conditions on the ground to recover. And I think it will take them another 2 years reading history, reading the Iraq history, for example, how they did that before. That's why I think leaving now is just the worst thing that anyone could do. But one thing I learned living in Washington over the past 3 years is it's a hopeless city. So they never do the right thing, even though it's clear whether it's the right thing.
Until they do the right thing, right?
Unless they have to go back and think about it again.
Churchill said that. Andrew, the question about the 2020, this actually Syria withdrawal decision created some really interesting dynamics. People who were opponents of getting involved more in Syria for such a long time were the ones who opposed Trump's decision. Actually, General mentioned it at the beginning. It became so partisan. And Congress is asserting itself more, at least the House, going forward. Do you see that sort of playing out on the Syria scene in terms of politics of it in this town?
I think it's likely that this will play a role in the foreign policy aspects of the 2020 campaign. Now, I caveat that by saying that I think the main battleground for the U.S. between President Trump and the Democratic opposition is primarily domestic in nature and much more oriented towards things here at home. And it is interesting. I mean, so I think it seemed to me that the main criticism that was coming from the Democratic side was about the pullout in general, and I think that gets into the superficial tweet aspects of things because it has to be condensed. I think the main, but many of the people in the Democratic Party political establishment wanted there to be a deal between the YPG and the regime at the end of this, including I think Brett McGurk, as far as I know. I mean, I've been in settings where he talked about the fabric of Syrian society going back together again, to use a metaphor. So. I think it was the pace, the timing of the decision, which was a concern to them, and that's why I think you see Elizabeth Warren coming out from a different part of the political spectrum, saying that, oh yeah, I actually think it's great to pull out of Syria. But again, this becomes a political hot potatoes, so to speak, because meanwhile, it's likely, unfortunately, that we're going to have more of these kind of attacks by ISIS because they're desperate, they're militarily being defeated, they have the ability, these sleeper cells, to carry out these attacks, and you get a lot of, we say, bang for the buck. So I think it'll be an issue in 2020, but unless it's tied to something much larger, I don't see it being the issue for the 2020 election.
I just comment, I don't think it's even going to come up. First of all, foreign policy is rarely an issue in presidential elections. I think that if they do talk foreign policy, it'll be much larger issues: role of China, role of Russia, reset buttons, so on and so forth. And candidly, the Democrats completely agree with President Trump on the issue of foreign intervention in the first place. President Trump's, one of his rationale for doing this is, he said, let's get out of dumb wars in the Middle East. I mean, that's the first thing that President Obama said is, Iraq was a dumb war. We need to focus on Afghanistan. So, no, unfortunately, I don't think it's going to be an issue at all because actually, President Trump is using the Democratic bullet points on the issue of foreign interventions. So don't expect Syria to be mentioned in the 2020.
But he criticized Obama for leaving in 2011, right?
He'll say whatever is necessary to make his argument. Iraq, he said.
Iraq,
yeah.
You guys, do we have more questions in the back? All right. Okay, one. Okay, there is no, I know, yeah. So she
I have
was
my own
saying,
question, if you don't mind.
Go ahead, go ahead.
Yes, regarding her question, which is about the area south 20 miles,
zone.
who's going to control the safe zone. So my question is, last year, some representatives from other Kurdish political parties in Syria were here in Washington, D.C., and they held some meetings here at the State Department. And lately, last week also, there are news saying that they held some other meetings with Turkish officials, which is the Syrian Kurdish National Council. So could we say that after the decision of the withdrawal of Syria, there might be some kind of a new deal between the United States and Turkey for finding another alternative for the YPG and SDF? They are just taking a look for other parties there? Thank you.
Well, can I address a little bit, just from the Turkish perspective, like, you know, there should be, these areas in the north should be repopulated with people who originally left from there. So any kind of sort of engineering of populations that happened over the past several years have to be reset from Turkish perspective, because they feel like YPG drove out a lot of the actually Kurdish actors, but also a lot of the civilians. And the reason a lot of Arabs were able to get onto the project of SDF was because of the US support. So if you create another power center, they believe that some of those Arabs will actually be coming back. They can be get adjusted or attached to the new kind of local administrations that would be empowered by Turkey and sort of. But I think repopulation of those areas is a critical issue. They don't want to make Kurdish cities Arab or vice versa. They want those original sort of whatever the percentages to be kind of reset. That's a critical issue from the Turkish perspective. So you can have a Kurdish majority town run by local councils that are dominated by the Kurds, but not controlled by YPG and indirectly PKK. That's their beef. Did anybody want to address this? Okay, then I'll give you the last closing remarks.
My question wasn't addressed.
And what was your question again?
Beyond the safe zone, who's going to control the safe zone and that entire territory below, let's say 20 miles, who's going to
Well, first of all, was that your question?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, so who's going to control the safe zone?
No, below the safe zone, south of it.
So Raqqa, Deir Zor, Hassan Hassan.
Sure. Well, I think that it was mentioned here that there's probably going to be an alignment between the YPG and the Syrian government. But I don't think it's going to be the United States' policy to either set the rules for that area nor try to impose a solution on that area.
Yeah,
So far that I've heard.
Yeah, I think it's a major goal of the United States for the regime and the Iranians and the Russians not to take over that area. How you achieve that, because of course you're dealing with the likelihood is not necessarily, I think in the short term, it's not a military offensive by the regime necessarily, but it could be a political détente and then arrangement between Damascus and the YPG. But we'll have to wait and see what they work out, because of course the regime wants, again, when it's engaged, feels confident and is even more rigid in negotiations than it is when it's under pressure. So I would suspect they're going to want quite a bit from the YPG, and that will give up their ideas of autonomy or something thereof.
Yeah.
And then, of course, the regime can also cut deals with the settled tribes and other Sunni Arab forces out there or groupings We see that they already do this. There was something out in Deir ez-Zor, I think just yesterday, the regime with one of the Bagara sheikhs and so on. So we can just expect more of this. It's a subset of this conflict to watch.
Yeah, I would make two comments. Number one, we've also not brought in the issue of the Iraqi forces. Prime Minister Abdul Mahdi has made an open offer to be going against Daesh because of his understanding that if Daesh does in fact, ISIS does in fact begin to expand again, it will come into Iraq. Second, I think we need to measure the zeitgeist inside this city about where this president stands with regards to foreign interventions. He is looking to do less rather than more, and I suspect that we will come to an understanding of what happens in that area, but I think it will be subject to a lot of debate before a final decision is made. But in the mind of this president, he would probably sit here and say, why is that our problem?
Mm-hmm. Hassan, Raqqa and Deir ez-Zor, these are Arab majority cities. So how is it being run now, and what do you expect this withdrawal decision could impact them?
So if the maps that we saw online of the safe zone or whatever security zone, whatever Turkey is trying to establish in the north, if that's what's going to happen, then I think that's Turkey's way of saying the YPG will not exist in Syria, the whole Syria, because that's really the Kurdish areas in the north. The rest of that, or beyond that area, there are no Kurdish majority areas, or not many. There are some, obviously, like Hasaka city. There are some Kurds there. So that leaves the question of who's going to take over if it's not Turkey or the YPG from in Raqqa and Deir ez-Zor. And it seems like it depends. Realistically, it seems like the regime is going to eventually go there, but maybe it's not going to be anytime soon. The SDF seems to be an alternative, at least explored in Damascus, for the Russians to take over, as in to take it's a sponsorship of. So the Russians will be overseeing the SDF or whatever the SDF is in Raqqa, in Hasaka, southern Hasaka, in Deir ez-Zor. And that, in theory, obviously I'm not talking about ideal scenarios, but these are the scenarios that are one of the horrible scenarios that are being explored. That solves one problem, which is that Iraqi borders and the coordination between the Iraqis and the Syrian regime, or the Americans when they were there with the Iraqis or the Shia militias in some areas, that complicates the situation because ISIS sometimes moves in areas where both sides, who otherwise would not cooperate with each other, have to somehow find a mechanism to talk about targeting who's who. So if Russia goes back to this area, that addresses that problem of the security architecture, becomes more meaningful in that sense. But again, I think it's a difficult question to answer because is your question about who is going to be there? Because we don't know. There's no clarity. Or who should be going there? Then we can go through a whole host of kind of list of options. But it seems like all the options are, I think the best option seems to be from all the existing options that Russia will take over rather than Iran or the regime in those areas.
I want to give you each 1 minute for final comments. Andrew.
I would say that it's important to, getting back to the original theme of this talk, to not focus on what the film or TV version is of a withdrawal, or even a fight against terrorism or the outcome of this war. I think it's very important just to keep your eye as much as possible on these, the way the Syrian war is settling out and the way that the different parties are reacting to the outcome of that settlement. And we're far from a settlement, I think. There are a lot of different ways this can go, and it could go sideways in a way. And we could end up in a situation where we get pulled into something in the future, but this time with a lot less than we have at the moment. And I think it's very important to be as rational as we possibly can at this critical time. And I know it's hard, especially these days, but I think we have to try.
Thank you, Andrew. Hassan.
I sort of said much of what I want to say, but I think the question is, I think the worst thing to watch, the worst thing that could happen in the next 2 years is not ISIS. It's really how the Syrian conflict will play out. And if all these forces agree on something, then maybe we have a hope that there's some peaceful transition. But I don't see peaceful, kind of orderly transition of these areas, handover to some force or another. But that doesn't seem to, that seems to be, to me, I'm convinced that they will leave gaps and probably speed up the recovery of ISIS from my assessment of 2 years from now into a year from now, becoming more disruptive than we thought. Again, look at Iraq and what happened in Iraq. People, analysts, if you talk to most analysts of Iraq, if you talk to them over the past 2 or 3 years, they didn't expect Iraq to return to violence or ISIS to recover because of the sheer numbers of the forces that were fighting ISIS. The paramilitary, the security forces. Iraq had the momentum, real momentum against ISIS, but that momentum was challenged by this local dynamics in some of the north of Iraq, but also the shift of hands from one force to another in Kirkuk that opened so much potential for ISIS in those areas. And I fear this is the moment that is really similar and comparable to what happened in 2017 in Iraq, and will be worse in Syria, because Syria is still, again, the peace is fragile. And the pieces are still scattered around, and it's not put together again. And there's so many stakeholders vying for one thing or another in Syria.
Well, thank you, Hassan. I hope we don't have another panel in 2 years about ISIS, but
you will.
We'll watch that. Thank you, General.
Yeah, first of all, I want to thank not only you for putting this together and my other co-panelists, but candidly, I think we've had a deeper debate inside this room from some very good questions that have been asked that you don't hear inside this town. So well done to you all as well. Second, just a counterpoint, I spend most of my time in Iraq working over there, and I've got very strong connections with both federal police, border police, Ministry of Defense. And all I would say is the Iraqi military and security force believe they have ISIS under control around Kirkuk. They would rather have a destabilized area with a minor presence of ISIS and the Kirkuk oil fields than the other option, which is one of the reasons that after the referendum they went back in. So I say that because I don't think that even if we saw a reemergence of ISIS to that level inside of Syria after the American leaves, that's manageable. That's in 25 different countries. That's not the apocalypse. ISIS is degraded to the point now where it is no longer an existential threat to the United States. They're not going to get on the airplane and fly into it, but they may. But the mission of the United States when it went back into Iraq was to assist the Iraqis to push back not only this force which was putting their country at risk. They were at the gates of Baghdad, and I was there. They have been pushed back. There is a small presence of terrorism, but certainly not large military forces, which they had before. And they seem to have that managed. We're seeing the same thing in Syria. Iraq is defeated. They have what they believe to be a manageable level of ISIS there. And I think, again, I'm not promoting, I'm explaining as an analyst should do. This president feels that, okay, ISIS is down to the point where it should no longer be the responsibility of the Americans to do it. If it's important to the region, let the region handle it. The last thing I would say, there are a lot of mixed messages out there about U.S. policy in the Middle East in general and Syria in particular. What I would simply say is where you may hear one thing from John Bolton, you might hear another thing from Mike Pompeo, and you may hear another thing from the president. I can tell you right now that the military takes, as they remind everybody, they take orders from the president, and as that great quip in the Washington Post from an unnamed defense official said, we don't take orders from John Bolton. I can tell you right now that there's a clarity of understanding by the U.S. forces on the ground and the coalition forces on the ground about which decision has been made. So I would listen very carefully to what the president says and don't use the other voices you might hear that sound contradictory to be standard U.S. policy. As the old saying goes, we only have one president at a time, and he sets the policy. And again, I don't say that as an advocate, I say that as an analyst.
Mm-hmm. Well, let me add one thing to this. Since 2014, the fall, this has been a major issue between U.S. and Turkey, and this kind of clarity General just mentioned is the positive thing from the Turkish perspective. How they're going to figure everything out, that's going to be difficult, and I think it is definitely full of all the risks and dangers that our panelists mentioned. But the willingness from the Turkish perspective that the U.S. wants to work with Turkey now, and it was actually, the relationship with YPG was transactional and transitory, that is giving Turkey confidence. But as I think this panel really shows, a lot of things will have to be figured out going forward. But I want to thank you all for spending this morning with us. We appreciate you being here. Please join me in congratulating the panel.
Oh, thank you for having us.